On the surface, she seemed like any other child, small, delicate, with a face that could have belonged to an innocent schoolgirl. But beneath that exterior lurked a darkness rarely seen in one so young. In 1968, the world was introduced to Mary Bell, an 11-year-old girl whose name would become synonymous with horror. Unlike other children her age, who played in the streets of Scotswood without a care in the world, Mary was different. She had a secret, one so sinister it would shock an entire nation. The crime that changed everything took place on May 25, 1968. A 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown was found dead inside a boarded-up house, his small body lying motionless on the floor. The cause of death? Unknown. There were no visible wounds, no blood, nothing to indicate foul play. At first, authorities thought it was a tragic accident. Perhaps the boy had wandered in and succumbed to some unseen hazard. But as investigators dug deeper, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The first sign that something wasn't right came just a day after Martin's funeral. His grieving family was still in shock, trying to process the loss of their little boy, when an unexpected visitor arrived at their doorstep. It was a young girl with short, dark hair and piercing eyes. Mary Bell. When Martin's mother answered the door, she was met with a question that sent chills down her spine. "Do you miss Martin?" Mary asked, her voice devoid of emotion. Before Mrs. Brown could respond, the child's next words sent her reeling. "I know he's dead. I wanted to see him in his coffin." The sheer callousness of the statement left Martin's mother in disbelief. Who was this child? Why was she speaking about her son's death with such eerie detachment? But at that moment, she had no way of knowing the full truth. No one did. Then came the second crime. Just 2 months later, on July 31st, the lifeless body of 3-year-old Brian Howe was discovered on wasteland near Scotswood. This time, there was no doubt. This was murder. Unlike Martin Brown, Brian's body bore unmistakable signs of violence. Small hands had left their mark around his throat, and his legs and stomach were covered in scratches. But the most horrifying detail? The letter M had been carved into his skin. Panic spread through the neighborhood. Who was capable of such monstrous acts? Who could kill not once, but twice, and leave behind such chilling evidence? The community was gripped by fear, parents keeping their children close, desperate to protect them from an unseen predator. What they didn't know was that the killer was already among them, watching, waiting, and enjoying every moment of the hysteria. As authorities scrambled to solve the case, the truth would soon come to light. And when it did, it would leave even the most hardened detectives questioning everything they thought they knew about human nature. But what could drive a child, an 11-year-old girl, to commit such brutal acts? The answer lay in Mary Bell's past, a history so tragic and twisted that it almost seemed inevitable she would one day become something unthinkable. And when the truth was finally revealed, it wasn't just the murders that horrified the world. It was the making of a monster. The community of Scotswood was still in shock over the sudden and mysterious death of 4-year-old Martin Brown. His lifeless body had been discovered inside an abandoned house, yet no obvious signs of violence pointed to a killer. The air in the small English town grew thick with fear and uncertainty. Was it an accident? Had the young boy simply wandered into danger on his own? Or was there something much darker lurking beneath the surface? While the town mourned Martin's death, another sinister event sent chills through the neighborhood. A local nursery was vandalized, and chilling notes were left behind. Messages taunting the police, almost as if the culprit was daring them to catch them. The messages read, "I murder so that I may come back," and "I kill because I want to." It was an eerie foreshadowing of what was to come. At first, the authorities dismissed the notes as an elaborate prank, but the truth was far more disturbing. Mary Bell, an 11-year-old girl with an unsettling presence, started behaving in ways that unsettled those around her. She would casually bring up Martin's death in conversation, even asking his grieving mother how she was feeling in a tone that felt more inquisitive than sympathetic. It was as if she was studying the impact of the tragedy rather than mourning alongside the town. Her fascination with death wasn't new. Her teachers had long noticed her disturbing tendencies, but no one could have imagined the horrors that lay ahead. Then just 2 months later, tragedy struck again. On the afternoon of July 31st, 1968, 3-year-old Brian Howe was reported missing. His family searched frantically, but their worst fears were realized when his small body was discovered in a desolate area of waste ground. This time there was no ambiguity. This was murder. His body bore disturbing marks, his hair had been cut clumsily, and chillingly, someone had carved a letter. For me, onto his stomach with a razor blade. Whoever had done this was making a statement. Investigators knew that the killer had to be someone young. The wounds, while violent, appeared hesitant, uncertain. This wasn't the work of a hardened criminal. It was something much more chilling. Someone still learning, someone testing their boundaries. And when officers began speaking with the local children, one name surfaced repeatedly: Mary Bell. But what drove an 11-year-old girl to commit such monstrous acts? The town was about to uncover a story so dark, so unsettling, that it would forever change their perception of innocence. And what investigators discovered next would leave them questioning whether evil was born or created. With the authorities closing in, Mary Bell's twisted games took a darker turn. She was no longer content with mere threats and unsettling behaviors. She wanted control, dominance, and most disturbingly, she wanted to feel the power of life and death in her own hands. Despite her young age, Mary exhibited disturbing patterns that mirrored those of seasoned criminals. She didn't just kill, she played with the emotions of those affected by her actions. While most would expect a child to display confusion or fear when confronted about a crime, Mary was different. She was cold, calculating, and eerily unfazed. Shortly after Brian Howe's body was discovered, police noticed something deeply unsettling. A letter M had been scratched into his chest. The wound was shallow, almost hesitant, as if Mary was still testing the limits of her own depravity. This small but significant detail solidified law enforcement's growing suspicion that they were dealing with a killer unlike any other. The chilling brutality didn't end with the murder itself. Investigators found that clumps of Brian's hair had been cut off, and his legs were mutilated with a pair of scissors. Even more haunting was the way Mary inserted herself into the very investigation meant to capture her. She lingered around the crime scene, listening intently to adults discuss the murder. When approached, she displayed an almost inappropriate curiosity, asking disturbing questions about the case, and even hinting at details that hadn't been made public. Then, in a move that would later be recognized as a classic trait of psychopathy, Mary visited Brian Howe's grieving mother. She looked her straight in the eyes and asked, "Do you miss your Brian?" The question alone was unsettling, but what came next was far worse. When Mrs. Howe broke down in tears, Mary calmly added, "I know something about it, but I can't tell you." For the investigators, this was a crucial moment. Children, especially young ones, do not normally display such a callous lack of empathy. Mary's interactions with the grieving family reinforced the growing belief that she was not just a troubled child, she was dangerous. And yet, despite her eerie behavior, there was still no concrete proof tying her directly to the crime. Then the breakthrough came. Mary's close friend and reluctant accomplice, Norma Bell, started to crack under pressure. Unlike Mary, Norma showed signs of guilt and fear. When questioned separately, the two girls' stories started to unravel. Norma pointed the finger at Mary, claiming she had seen her take Brian away on the day of his death. But Mary, ever the manipulator, attempted to turn the tables, shifting blame onto Norma instead. Investigators now faced a critical question. Could a child truly be capable of such calculated evil? The answer was about to shock everyone. As Mary sat in the interrogation room, her demeanor was eerily composed. The officers watching her noted the unsettling way she carried herself, calm, detached, and seemingly unfazed by the horrific crimes she was accused of committing. Unlike most children her age, who would be trembling at the thought of facing the law, Mary barely flinched. She played with her fingers, her eyes darting around the room as if she was analyzing everything, as if this was merely a puzzle for her to solve. Her responses to questioning were chilling. When asked why she had harmed Brian and Martin, her answers were evasive, yet disturbingly revealing. "I wanted to see what it felt like," she said at one point, her tone devoid of remorse. Investigators struggled to comprehend how a child could harbor such dark impulses. Was it her upbringing, a genetic flaw, or something far more sinister lurking within her mind? Mary's home life had been an unrelenting nightmare, a battleground where innocence had no chance of survival. Her mother, Betty, had exposed her to horrors no child should endure. The emotional and physical wounds inflicted on her had shaped her into something different, something broken. Experts who later analyzed her case would debate whether Mary was a victim of her environment or if she had been born with an innate darkness. Psychologists began dissecting Mary's psyche, trying to understand what had driven her to commit such brutal acts at such a young age. Many pointed to her mother's abuse, the neglect, and the exposure to violence as key factors. However, some experts were convinced that Mary displayed signs of a deeper psychological disturbance, one that could not be explained solely by her upbringing. Dr. Orton, a psychologist who evaluated Mary, described her as a textbook example of sociopathy. She exhibited no real emotional connection to others. There was no remorse, no fear, no genuine sadness. Instead, she seemed resentful, angry at being caught rather than at what she had done. His words painted a picture of a young girl who, despite her tender age, already showed traits common in the most dangerous criminals. Her ability to manipulate those around her was another chilling aspect of her personality. Even in custody, she sought control over the narrative, shifting blame, feigning emotions when it suited her, and crafting her own version of events. But the facts were undeniable. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The question was no longer if Mary had committed the crimes, but why, and whether she would ever be capable of change. As Mary's trial loomed closer, the public's fascination with her case grew into an obsession. The idea of a child murderer, one who killed not out of desperation, but seemingly out of curiosity, was too horrifying to ignore. But what the world didn't know was that Mary Bell's story was far from over. And as she stood before the court, her fate hanging in the balance, one question lingered in the air. Was she a monster in the making, or merely a child lost in the darkness of her past? The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with tension as the jury settled into their seats. A hush fell over the spectators as Mary Bell, just 11 years old, sat before the judge. Her expression was unreadable, a stark contrast to the devastated families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe, who watched with tear-streaked faces. This was not just another trial. It was the trial of a child accused of unthinkable acts of murder. Prosecutors wasted no time painting Mary as a cold-blooded killer, a girl without remorse, driven by something dark and dangerous lurking within her. The evidence was laid bare, the chilling notes left behind at the scene, the disturbing way she had mutilated Brian Howe's body, and the eerie way she had inserted herself into the police investigation, relishing the attention. Witnesses recounted how she boasted about the murders, showing no fear of getting caught. One child testified that Mary had told her, "I killed Martin Brown, and I'll do it again." But the defense had their own argument. They claimed Mary was a product of her upbringing, a childhood so traumatic, so violent, that it had twisted her ability to understand right from wrong. They brought forward medical experts who diagnosed her with sociopathic tendencies, arguing that her actions stemmed from emotional detachment, not evil intent. Dr. Orton, a psychiatric expert, testified that Mary displayed a complete lack of empathy, an absence of guilt that suggested deep psychological disturbance. Her childhood, marred by neglect and abuse, had shaped her into someone who viewed violence not as horror, but as normalcy. The jury listened intently, their expressions unreadable as they weighed the arguments. The prosecution painted her as a monster, the defense as a victim of tragic circumstances. But what was the truth? Could an 11-year-old truly comprehend the gravity of her crimes? And if she couldn't, did that make her any less dangerous? As the trial progressed, Mary's mother, Betty Bell, made frequent appearances, sobbing dramatically for the cameras, pleading for sympathy. Some saw her as a grieving mother, others as an opportunist eager to exploit the media frenzy for her own gain. Many wondered, if Mary had been raised by someone else, in a different environment, could she have been saved from this path? Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom held its breath as the foreman stood, the slip of paper trembling in his hands. The fate of Mary Bell was about to be sealed. What would they decide? A child beyond redemption or a victim of fate? The silence stretched on, suffocating as the judge prepared to read the final judgment. With the trial concluded and Mary Bell found guilty of manslaughter, the justice system faced a dilemma. What does one do with an 11-year-old killer? Unlike hardened criminals, Mary was a child, yet her actions were chillingly deliberate. The judge sentenced her to an indefinite period of detention, specifying that she was to be held at the Secretary of State's discretion. This meant that Mary's future was uncertain. She would be released only when deemed no longer a threat to society. At first, Mary was sent to Red Bank, a secure unit for troubled youth. It was an unusual place for a girl, as it primarily housed boys with behavioral issues. But authorities believed that given Mary's crimes, she needed close supervision and a setting that could provide psychological evaluation. Red Bank was no ordinary juvenile facility. It housed some of the country's most disturbed young offenders, including, in later years, one of the killers of James Bulger. Here, Mary's intelligence and manipulative tendencies became apparent. She was observed charming staff members while maintaining a calculating distance from her peers. Psychologists noted her lack of remorse and her eerie ability to compartmentalize her crimes. Reports from staff at Red Bank painted a complex picture of Mary. On the surface, she could be engaging and articulate, her striking blue eyes often masking the darkness that lay beneath. But there were moments when the facade cracked, bursts of anger, unsettling comments, and an air of superiority. She seemed to enjoy the attention her case brought her, sometimes boasting about how she had fooled adults into underestimating her. As Mary grew older, the authorities struggled to determine what rehabilitation should look like for a child who had killed. She had no model for a healthy family, no real sense of empathy, and a past filled with abuse and neglect. Could she truly be reformed, or would she always be a danger to those around her? Eventually, Mary was transferred to another facility where she experienced more structured education and therapy. But even in these settings, her behavior remained unpredictable. Some staff believed she was improving, learning to express herself in ways that didn't involve violence. Others were less convinced, wary of the glimpses of manipulation that still surfaced in her interactions. Her story gripped the public, and as time passed, questions arose. Could a child truly understand the depth of the horrors she had committed? Was she a victim of her circumstances, or had something darker been ingrained in her from the beginning? Society was divided. Some viewed Mary as a product of a failed system, while others saw her as a monster who could never be trusted outside prison walls. Years would pass before any decision about her release would be made. But one thing was certain: Mary Bell was no ordinary child, and the world would not soon forget her name. The case of Mary Bell remains one of the most chilling in criminal history, a stark reminder of how a troubled childhood can twist innocence into something unrecognizable. It forces us to question how society handles young offenders and whether true rehabilitation is possible for those who commit the unthinkable. What do you think? Should Mary Bell's past continue to follow her, or did she deserve the anonymity granted to her? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most disturbing cases in true crime history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. We bring you gripping, in-depth true crime stories just like this every week. Your support helps us continue to uncover the dark and haunting tales that shape our world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.